So I get the floor for a bit. This generation that I was born into has this great tension, as I see it, between a set of contradictions, if you will, of American life. You know, I was sort of born into the tail end of the 1960s, where we were in this middle of this great wave of progressive politics in the United States and really around the world. But really at the beginning of a new pivot, a pivot to what some now call neoliberalism. Karl Polanyi, who warned my parents' generation, baby boomers, of the merging of social and economic lives in the 1950s, called this the market society, and sent out a number of warnings about the so-called market society. And this was this sort of tension that I was born into in Generation X of, to what extent have our social lives and our economic lives merged? And that's how often neoliberalism or neoliberal thought is characterized. Dick Norgaard, an ecological economist who I've learned a lot from, calls this cultural epoch that we're in the econocene. Different than the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, you've probably all heard by now, is this geological epoch that geologists are making the case that we live in a human-dominated global Earth system. But within the Anthropocene, Norgaard and others have made the case that we live in the econocene, right? There's a subset of the human race that is responsible for this human domination, is responsible for the wholesale destruction of our Earth systems. And it's the reduction of all social relations to market logic that is characterizing this thing called the econocene, and perhaps characterizing what folks have called neoliberalism. So where we want to get to in this policy workshop is to think about an opening right now. Sean and our project and others have introduced the idea of a policy window, right? Is there a policy window that represents kind of a counter movement to this long tail of a neoliberal movement? And so I want to unpack that a little bit and set the stage for this workshop. So I've been thinking a lot about this. As some of you who know me know, I've been using my quarantine time in hopefully a productive way by trying to write a new book. And if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to read from some notes from a section of this book that I'm struggling with right now, that is about this kind of neoliberal turn, because I think this really situates, for me at least, the role of something called an ecozoic policy project, and the need to really rethink sometimes I use the word social contract. I don't love it, but the social contract of higher education, the purpose of higher education, and maybe the repurposing of higher education in service of a new era. So just a few thoughts to get us started. So the term neoliberalism, I learned in my research, was proposed at the 1938 Walter Lippmann Colloquium to signal a break from the past. Lippmann, which again I learned in my research, was a prominent American journalist, credited as the most influential of the 20th century by some accounts. And this Paris gathering of European intellectuals explored his book at the time in 1938, an inquiry into the principles of the good society that had been published actually the previous year. So that kind of life and times of the folks who were at that meeting, it was the fear of rising fascism in Europe was front and center. You're going to see a lot of similarities here along the way. As were the failures of classic liberalism, if you will, especially the extremes of laissez-faire ideology that then had brought the world to the depths of the Great Depression. So discussions of this new liberalism, neoliberal, right? New liberalism, were wrestling with these competing visions of liberty and the role of the state in a market economy. Friedrich Hayek, who many of you who have thought about or read about economics probably have come across this individual at some point in time. He's sort of the poster child of a libertarian movement within economics. Friedrich Hayek featured among the attendees in this 1938 meeting and found inspiration there for his life's work. While the defeat of fascism and the rise of Keynesianism, right, to kind of come out of the Great Depression, would sideline the neoliberal project after the war, Hayek and other participants in this Paris meeting waited and organized and patiently kind of waited for their opening. In fact, you may have heard of the Mont Pelerin Society, named after a resort in Switzerland where they all met first to kind of nurture the ideas of neoliberalism. This society for decades helped nurture a small but well-funded group of conservative economists who eventually seized a moment of a Nixon presidency right around the time when I was born, and ultimately seeded the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. Guardian columnist George Monbiot writes a lot of in areas that intersect quite a bit with ecological economics. Monbiot describes neoliberalism that then reemerged in the 1970s and 80s as a political movement, where citizens were cast as consumers, quote, whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency, and where society is organized around a competitive market that, quote, ensures that everyone gets what they deserve. To me, that really strikes a chord as the kind of core aspect of this neoliberal thought. Neoliberalism is often conflated with other terms like neoconservatism, libertarianism, laissez-faire, market fundamentalism. They all have these kind of intersecting themes. To me, its distinguishing feature is the essence of economism, or what I was talking about with the econocene, right? The reduction of all social relations to market logic. And this so-called neoliberal turn of the 1970s witnessed the fusion of libertarian politics and free market economics into one thing, the politics and the economics coming together. We all know, at least I think we all know, if you've grown up in Western societies, Western cultures, we all know the bedtime story of this master narrative, right? Freedom is market choice. Free enterprise creates jobs. Regulations reduce choice and kill jobs. Government is inefficient and incompetent. Millionaires and billionaires earned what they produced. The poor and unemployed are lazy and deserve what they get, is the kind of narrative that I grew up with in my formative years in high school in the 1980s. Its modern version came in the form of Reaganomics, a full merger of you get what you deserve politics with a vote with your dollars economics. Tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation of business and banks, slashes to social programs. These were the policy principles of Reaganomics. Reaganisms became the economisms of my generation. Some Reaganisms, right? As government expands, liberty contracts. Unemployment insurance is a prepaid vacation for freeloaders. The most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And perhaps the most ironic of Reagan's quotes is, quote, the best minds are not in government. If any were, business would steal them away. So, I grew up with this oratory from Ronald Reagan as a white male growing up in the United States, in the Northeast United States. Reagan's oratory was a product of, which I only realized later, a slow burn of this neoliberal movement in America. Well-funded, pro-business advocacy groups and think tanks that patiently cultivated and promulgated a focused narrative. Some of the most influential of these well-funded groups included the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which was founded all the way back in 1912. The American Enterprise Institute, founded at the time of this sort of labeling of neoliberalism in 1938. The Institute of Economic Affairs in 1955. The Heritage Foundation in 1973. The Cato Institute in 1974. Each of these groups has a Rolodex of all-star neoliberal thinkers and funders with multi-million-dollar budgets, extensive networks of political commentators, expert witnesses, editorial writers, and academic researchers. They routinely top lists of the highest spending DC lobbyists in any given year. And they put out, in any given year, hundreds of policy briefs, media advisories, and research reports. And we're going to carve off this one element and think about the role and impact of policy briefs historically and going forward. And they've been doing this day in and day out for years, really, since my formative years in the late 70s, early 80s. Let's just take a little detour. Consider the power and influence of just the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In recent decades, they have been, without any close second, the highest spending lobbyist in Washington, D.C. by a long shot. Originally founded to consolidate remember, they were founded back in, and I wrote it down here, 1912. They were originally founded to consolidate a pro-business voice against the rising labor and consumer protection movements of Teddy Roosevelt's time. The chamber evolved into a political influence machine representing the interests of legacy industries like oil, tobacco, banks, and then all of their family wealth. The foundation to their current strategies are outlined in a very famous or infamous, I guess, depending on your perspective, Powell Memo, a confidential memorandum written on August 23rd, 1971 by Lewis Powell to the Chamber's education director. So Powell was a corporate lawyer. He was a Philip Morris board member, and at the time, he was a soon-to-be Nixon appointee to the Supreme Court. Powell provided a litany of examples from college campuses, the media, and other what he called new leftists as proof of what he entitled an attack on American free enterprise system. Okay, so this is 1971. He issued, basically in his memo, a call to arms. He outlined a blueprint for the Chamber of Commerce and the broader pro-business lobby that was grounded in, quote, in Powell's words, careful, long-range planning and implementation, inconsistency of action over an indefinite period of years. Okay, this is back in 71. In the scale of financing available only through joint effort and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations. I just want to stress this. It's not like, he wrote the game plan and everyone followed. It's one example of many of these kinds of game plans. Powell's multi-pronged strategy included building an army of conservative intellectuals to be deployed on college campuses as a counterbalance to left-leaning academics, like myself. He recommended an evaluation of social science textbooks by, quote, eminent scholars who believe in the American system, development of, quote, attractive, articulate, well-informed speakers who would advocate for, quote, equal time on the college speaking circuit, and a targeted outreach approach to graduate schools of business in particular. In the media, Powell's strategy similarly called for a deployment of scholars and speakers, monitoring of any criticism of the free enterprise system, and financial incentives to publish across a full spectrum of, my donkey doesn't like this, William Wallace is his name, to publish across a full spectrum of magazines, newspapers, books, and scholarly journals. And to round things out, both political action and judicial influence, the more things change, the more they stay the same, were called upon to defend business interests with no, quote, reluctance to penalize politically those who oppose it. So again, the Powell Memo is one example of that I did some research into as a nice kind of framing of the neoliberal movement. It's one example of setting a targeted agenda for a coordinated neoliberal turn. The resulting organized and well-funded strategies led to political, media, and academic capacity and influence. Corporate public affairs offices in DC grew from just 100 in 1968 to over 500 by 1978. registered corporate lobbyists from 175 firms in 1971 to over 2,500 by 1982. Corporate political action committees from under 300 in 1976 to over 1,200 by 1980. A wave of new conservative think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, produced reams and reams and reams of policy papers to arm their hand-picked political candidates. To take their example, the Heritage Foundation, their mandate for leadership, look it up, released in January 1981, included more than 2,000 recommendations in what United Press International called at the time, quote, a blueprint for grabbing the government by its frayed New Deal lapels and shaking out 48 years of liberal policy. So this actually became known as the Manifesto of the Reagan Revolution and was circulated at his very, very, very first cabinet meeting. And an estimated 60% of the individual suggestions in the mandate for leadership were implemented or initiated by the end of Reagan's first year in office. So this was a profound ideological shift in America. A 1997 study commissioned by the National Committee of Responsible Philanthropy investigated the grant-making strategies of conservative foundations in their pursuit of this overtly ideological agenda based on industrial and environmental deregulation, privatization of government services, deep reductions in federal anti-poverty spending, and the transfer of authority and responsibility for social welfare from the national government to the charitable sector and state and local government. So in their study, their 1997 study, grants from the top 12 conservative foundations with largely unrecognizable names, at least to me, to the general public, barring the now infamous Koch brothers, were investigated over a period from 1992 to 1994, right? So the tail end of the George I period in the United States and into the Clinton years. Funding prioritized first and foremost, why I'm giving this long introduction, college campuses and education networks. 42% of all charitable giving of these conservative foundations went to college campuses and education networks. Followed in second place, 38% went to think tanks, and then much smaller percentages to media groups, legal organizations, state and regional think tanks, and religious and other philanthropic institutions. So college campuses and education networks and national think tanks like the Heritage Foundations of the world received, do the math here, 80% of the funding during this study of the one wave of conservative funding. So I dug deeper into the academic piece. The academic grants were issued to endow professorships, write new curricula, fund public policy centers, underwrite research that was targeted at building and extending the theory and philosophy of free market economics and limited government. Number one on the list of the 145 academic grantees that this one study looked at was the University of Chicago. No surprise to any of us who study economics. They received nearly 12% of all funding during the study period, followed closely by Harvard at 11%. Highlights include support of the growing popularity of law and economics programs, their influence on deregulation, conservative leadership training in public policy schools and centers, and efforts to resist multiculturalism in favor of the, quote, universal culture of Western civilization. And my quote there is from Boston University's president at the time in the early 1990s. So beyond colleges and universities, I'm almost wrapping up here, education funding also went to networking organizations such as the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, a free market group founded in 1953 with broad and sustained presence on college campuses to prepare students for, quote, what they call to defend and advance the principles that made America free and prosperous, end quote. In a 1989 speech to the Heritage Foundation, the International Collegiate Studies Institute president at the time, Kenneth Cribb, made clear the higher education strategy was to, quote, provide resources and guidance to an elite which can take up anew a task of enculturation, and that this, quote, coming age of such elites has provided the current leadership of the conservative revival. And I would argue we're on the kind of, coattails of these investments that happened in the 1980s and early 1990s. This chorus, the chorus of the revival, was very simple, very effective. Public is bad, private is good. Government is inept, business is brilliant. The poor are freeloaders, the rich are hardworking. Planning is inefficient and political, markets are efficient and fair. Cooperation is for losers, competition is for winners. These were the stark contrasts of an all-encompassing worldview that was really resurrected from my grandparents' youth from the 1920s, questioned by the baby boomers in the 1960s, but then ultimately paved Reagan and Thatcher's path to what Thatcher called to change the heart and soul. And it worked, in my estimation. My generation, Generation X, was rooted in this narrative. And then, in fact, when my generation was first initially quite politically active during the Clinton years, the Clinton campaign was rooted in this narrative, right? The Clinton campaign wrote, if you remember, on their war board, quote, "The economy's stupid," right? On the strategy board of their war room. And we kind of all nodded our heads in unison. I was told by my father to go study business, go study economics, right? This is what was going to change the world. When George W. Bush responded to the 9/11 terrorist attacks with a plea to go shopping to save the economy, we pulled out our MasterCards and our Visas and we got to work. And when big oil-funded climate economists preached that the market will innovate and adapt, we kept driving and flying and burning in the hopes of a technological savior. With all human values reduced to economic logic, that is the kind of dream of the market society that Karl Polanyi warned my parents about, and the dream of the econocene that Dick Norgaard warned my generation about. And that is the broader context, if you will, I hope Matt would agree, of what we're thinking about with this Ecozoic policy project. So that's a brain dump if you ever saw one. Sorry for that. That's the context of thinking about a new era of policy work and policy research that, in my view, represents a counter movement to this neoliberalization of education, research, and the academy more generally. So if you're interested in just a little bit of that, then you've come to the right workshop. Because what we want to discuss is what would the new narrative look like, and what would a series of trainings and policy briefs and policy research look like that would kind of represent, in many ways, a rewriting of the social contract of higher education. So what I want to shift to now is just thinking and use the chat board again for some interaction before we do our breakout groups, is just play a little bit of word association with you to think about this thing called the Green New Deal. So let me pull up some notes on that. And maybe before I do that, I'll take any questions or comments or thoughts. I haven't been following the chat here. I've been sticking to my notes. Nina says very valuable to know the history. Thank you. Okay.
John, can I ask about
dive in, Julian.
Your research revealed about James Buchanan and the Virginia schools for political economy? I know that in the recent book, Democracy in Chains, that kind of excoriated Buchanan's contributions. I'm curious what you found in your own research.
Yeah, I mean, Buchanan won a Nobel Prize in economics, and he was very involved with the Mont Pelerin Society in the late 70s, early 80s. Went to one of these famous meetings in Chile during the Pinochet regime, where everyone was praising the Chilean experiment with market liberalization, and was highly influential in merging political science with economics, with free market economics, right? And really influential in sort of using cost benefit analysis, a way to study and think, in his words, rationally through policy design. So that's a whole nother story, but Buchanan, it certainly intersects tremendously with this, and some of the recent analysis of his work, I think, is quite revealing of the influence that thinking has had on what I was mentioning in my research on policy schools, policy programs, MPA programs. Julian, I know you come from one, and Rigo from another. Very influential on Masters of Public Administration programs, in my view, in a horrible way. But Buchanan was a big influence for sure. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Rigo's asking, is Green New Deal is antithetical to neoliberalism? So this discussion is very important. Thanks, Rigo. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's what we're up against. The Green New Deal is a narrative, and what does that narrative represent? Is it a kind of greening of capitalism? Is it something new altogether? Is it a return to some of the broken promises of the New Deal era? Is it a return to some of the broken promises of the Great Society era? And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about now. Thanks, Juan, for that. If you find that link to the Atlantic piece, I remember seeing something there as well about Buchanan recently that I thought was really quite valuable. That was going around my internet circles. Okay, part two, and then we're going to take like a quick break, and then we're going to do the workshopy part of this. So part two is to think now about your generation or my generation or my parents' generation. Like, is it a time for a new narrative? Is the Green New Deal represent that? What do we like about it? What we don't like about it? And how could a policy initiative that comes from a project that calls itself ecozoic, right? That's meant to kind of try to rebuild or cultivate or rethink the relationship both from human to human, but human to non-human. What might that look like, and what might policy research look like in service of a more harmonious version of the world? So, COVID is front and center here, right? As I mentioned, I had my own kind of COVID moment this morning with some folks that are helping me put a new bedroom in our house for my mom. One was three stages removed from someone who was tested positive. So now all of a sudden we're like, But we're hearing a lot about, the narrative is either let's get back to normal, right? Or the narrative, like in my circles, is like, wait a minute, hold on, time out. Normal was already in crisis. Do we really want to go back to normal? Is there a new normal? I think, Katie, you've used the words radical new normal. What would normal look like, or what should we be pushing for? Do we want to get back to the status quo? Or do we want to kind of chart a new course for society in this moment? And the question I think that we can ask, and a lot of you are grounded in higher education one way or another, is what's the role of higher education? In particular, we want to think about that in the second part of this afternoon. What are some strategies and tools to bridge the purpose of this workshop, academic research, to political action? So let's remind ourselves that, in my opinion, normal was already in crisis. Pick your crisis: climate crisis, extinction crisis, crisis of growing inequality, crisis of persistent racism. Normal was already in crisis. A lot of people in our world were already extremely vulnerable to the normal system, and now are extra vulnerable to this so-called abnormal world that we live in now. And you've probably heard it. I certainly have a lot. If we look back at past crises in recent histories, we always see that with crisis comes opportunity. So my question for you is, whose crisis and whose opportunity, right? If you come at this from the perspective of Wall Street, that's one opportunity, one crisis. If you come at this from the perspective of Main Street, that's quite another one. Come at this perspective from myself, a white male of privilege in the United States, that's one perspective. If you come from this perspective of more vulnerable communities who don't have the privileges that I have been afforded in my life, that's quite another perspective. So many of what we call progressive policies emerged out of crises, often as a counterbalance to years of concentration of power and wealth and years of systemic racial, economic, and environmental injustices. So that's how I choose to frame this moment, right? Is to think about rewriting some of the wrongs of the past. So, chat box, here we go. Let's think back to the Great Depression and the New Deal coalition that arose from the 1930s crisis, because we're borrowing this language in the Green New Deal. We're borrowing the New Deal piece of it, right? Word association. What do you associate with the words New Deal? Chat box, go for it. Brain dump. What do you associate with the words New Deal? Okay, Matt, FDR, financial regulation, Wall Street, Dust Bowl, Roaring Twenties, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, Social Security, potential, another vote for Social Security, court packing, that's a new one for me, need for, I'm not familiar, was there a court packing debate back then? Vulnerability, hope, tree planting, fireside chats. R.B. Bennett, Canada's prime minister, had a New Deal that failed. I need to know more about that too. I'm very U.S.-centric when it comes to New Deal. Hope, sustainability, recovery, work. Work was a big part. Conservation ag programs, great. Centrist Dems of the 20s. Reparation, interstates, justice. This is great. This is great. So let me do a quick synopsis here. This was part 2 of this workshop is on political agenda. Okay, this was a political agenda, full stop, that lifted many out of poverty and the unemployment lines, but also left many behind. The New Deal was a multi-year agenda, born out of the crisis of the Great Depression. So FDR was noted, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt's full cabinet, and I didn't realize this myself, his full cabinet was sworn in together just hours after his March 4th, 1933 inauguration. For whatever reason, the president was inaugurated in March back then. Within the first 100 days of the new administration, 15 major bills were passed and 99 executive orders were signed. I can't stress this enough, how fast political change can happen. The philosophical shift was quite clear from the beginning. Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, the very first woman cabinet member and was, quote, the moral conscience, is what she was called, of the Roosevelt administration. It was Frances Perkins who advocated for a 40-hour work week, minimum wage, unemployment compensation, abolishing child labor, Social Security, which was mentioned, Federal Employment Service, universal health insurance, which wasn't achieved. Roosevelt took on nearly wartime powers through regulating prices, issuing new debt, and broadly stimulating the economy, the Keynesian piece, right? Through the government's ability to borrow and spend. So let's fast forward to the 1960s. We're going to do a whirlwind tour of history here to get up to the opportunity for the Green New Deal. And the Great Society agenda, same game, word association, chat box. What do you associate with the words Great Society? Hit it, your turn. Okay, Rigo, thank you for getting us started. Civil Rights Act. War on poverty. You can certainly say things that were already said if that's what you were thinking. Don't be shy. Great Society, LBJ. So before it was FDR, now LBJ from Sam. Medicare or Medicaid. Yep. Both, in fact. Public housing. Community programs. Keep it coming, folks. People, are you all familiar more with the New Deal than the Great Society? Yeah. Education. Skylar says yes. I assume you're saying yes to my question. I've found this, actually. I've played this kind of word association a few times, and young people are way more familiar with the 1930s than they were the policy agendas of the 1960s. Voting Rights Act. Nice, Rigo. Maybe Rigo's probably Googling, though. No, I'm just kidding. I have no association with it. From Sean. Okay. Food stamps. Not from the U.S., so the terms are new to me. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a U.S.-centric discussion so far, but there were kind of this progressive pulse that was represented in the U.S. of the Great Society era was certainly happening in other places. Affordable housing, Vietnam backdrop. Yeah, Vietnam actually was something that ultimately was kind of the undoing of the Great Society agenda. Yeah, so I'll do another quick recap here. But as the economic turmoil of the 1930s created, okay, this is important, the policy window discussion, right? The economic turmoil of the 1930s created a mandate for FDR. The political turmoil, the economy was going gangbusters, but the political turmoil of the 1960s created a mandate for Lyndon Johnson. So in the U.S., the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, created a political mandate for change that had not been seen since the New Deal years. Lyndon Johnson capitalized on this. He signed long stalled civil rights legislation that Kennedy tried to get signed and never happened. But this moment, he was able to sign long stalled civil rights legislation into law on July 2nd, 1964, less than a year after Kennedy's assassination. This momentum continued into his first term as a duly elected president. Johnson was Kennedy's vice president, became president, then he was elected himself to a term of president. Just like before, massive rapid change, submitting 87 bills to the 89th Congress, right? 2-year Congress term, and signing all but 3 of those 87 bills into law within the first 9 months. The first 9 months of his new presidential term. So this political agenda, right, set into motion sweeping economic, social, environmental movements that we still recognize today in much of the mainstream movement politics. But just as with the New Deal, many, many, many promises were left unfilled, and many progressive changes were overturned or ultimately underfunded. So Vietnam really hurt Johnson quite a bit, and resulted in part, but to the swing to the right to Nixon on a promise to get us out of Vietnam, which didn't actually come true anytime soon. The 1970s brought inflation, recessions, oil crisis, the election of Nixon in 1968, and it set the table for what we talked about earlier, set the table for this neoliberal turn, right? So this pendulum, right, in American politics is swinging, right? This pendulum is swinging. So I've already set the table for this next word association, but now I want to hear from you all. What do you associate with the term neoliberalism? Neoliberalism. What comes to mind when I say neoliberalism? Come on, Rigo. Rigo loves history, so we're going to get Thatcher. Death. Oh, boy. Failure. Markets. Markets will solve all. Free markets. Equilibrium. Free markets. Globalization. Thatcher. Consumerism. Anything 2010s leftists dislike? Okay. union busting, invisible hand, privatization everywhere, deregulation, power to transnationals, destruction of the environment, deregulation, unethical power. Okay. Preaching to the choir here. Tina, there is no alternative. BS, extreme individualism, consolidation, IMF, World Bank. Yeah, there's a whole international story that I get into with my book, the so-called Washington Consensus. Economic restructuring. Great. Yeah, so this, think of the neoliberal movement of the 70s as a counter movement to the Great Society, and also this kind of grabbing the New Deal lapels. What was that quote I said? By their frayed lapels, right? And shaking out any vestiges of liberal policy from FDR's era. So yeah, I've kind of already reviewed the Mandate for Leadership, this blueprint for the neoliberal turn that was released in January 1981, the month of Reagan's inauguration. The 2,000 recommendations, about 60% of which were put into place in the first year. Again, quick change. Okay, I'm emphasizing, you can see the elections on my mind, the US election, right? Because quick ideological shift. And it was a shift in America that was purposeful and profound, and it kind of set the table for a neoliberal turn, not just for the political right in the United States and Canada and other places, but also the political left as well. The center, if you will, moved to the right. Other crises, other political agendas would arise, especially at the international level throughout the 80s and 90s. Debt crises from the left, the International Sustainable Development Agenda came out of the Global South's debt crisis of the 1980s. From the right, the next wave of American-led militarism came out of the 9/11. Most recently, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the 1% narrative, right, which you all are now accustomed to, came out of this hugely unequal economic recovery following the Great Recession. And it remains to be seen what will come out of this pandemic and the Trump years and et cetera, et cetera. And to a large extent, we're still living on this kind of the long coattails of this neoliberal turn. Each of these movements didn't arise from nowhere or only because a new president was elected. Okay, so sometimes people think it's all about the presidential election. Each was either from the political left or the right, arose out of years and years and years of organizing around common goals and vision. And each of these movements was a product of its own time, its own crises, and its own shift in power. And each represented, in my view, a values shift in society. So our big framing question for the rest of this policy workshop is, what will the elements of a new vision and a new power base for 2020 and beyond look like? And what would a decade of something like or similar to or inspired by the Green New Deal look like? That's where we're going to start the real workshopy part of what I've got planned for us for the second half, second 2/3, I should say. So we've spent a little less than an hour on introductions, my kind of rant about the neoliberal movement, and just reviewing together kind of these pulses of either progressive or conservative movements that have happened from the US context since the 1930s. So that's going to set the table for thinking about policy research and policy design, and hopefully linking some of your own research interests and experience to this idea of political action, or at least to policy alternatives.